This is Chad Carlson, historian with the Georgia Department of Transportation, and we're at 3rd Avenue and Ward Street in the Pleasant Hill neighborhood of Macon, Georgia. And if you could tell me your name and where you live and what your association is with Pleasant Hill.
Okay, my name is Hamp Swain, although been called by other names like King B and Deacon Swain and other names, but I live at 3171 Stratford Drive here in Macon. That's on the east side of town. Originally, when I came to Macon a few years ago, we lived on Pleasant Hill with my mother. We moved in from Unadilla, Georgia, with my mother at 322 Monroe Street, corner of Monroe at Woodliff in Macon.
Okay, and today is December 3rd, 2015.
Right. We moved from Unadilla, Georgia, where I had been living with my grandparents, to Macon a few years ago. I can't recall the year, but I was in probably the 3rd or 4th grade at that time, and we attended the L.H. Williams Elementary School, which is a couple of blocks away from here, for a couple of years, and after that we transferred to the Green Street Elementary School, which was within a few stepping feet from our house, as we lived on the corner of Monroe and Woodliff, just up the hill, and we were there.
And where were you born?
I was born in Macon, Georgia.
Okay. Here in Pleasant Hill, or?
No, I was born at the, well, it was known then as the Macon Hospital. It has had several name changes since that time, but the Macon Hospital was my place of birth back in the year of 1929.
And can you tell us a little bit about your parents and your siblings?
Okay, my mother was Susie McIntosh. My father was Hamp Swain. My father worked on the MD&S Railroad, and my mother was, at that time when she moved to Macon, many years before I was born, a few years before I was born, she did domestic work, and I was given to my grandparents, or they kept me until I moved back to Macon a few years later. But my mother, being a single parent at that time and living with an uncle on 5th Street, she could not afford and didn't have the time to take care of a little baby. So I went back to Unadilla, I should say, to live with the grandparents there, Mr. and Mrs. Grady Harrell of Unadilla, both of whom have passed on to a greater glory. And after my mother got a foothold of such, she wanted us, my sister and I, to move in to Macon with her, and we did. I had a sister by the name of Ardenia, 2.5 years older than she was. And of course, since that time, I've acquired a couple of other brothers, Anthony McIntosh and Wendell McIntosh, as my mother married a Mr. Lewis McIntosh from Macon, and they had a couple of kids.
And was your mom from Macon originally herself?
No, she was not. She was from Dooley County, and she left Dooley County, coming to Macon for a better life, she hoped, I guess. Better jobs, better opportunities, and that kind of thing. So she moved in to Macon with an uncle of mine, Roosevelt Discern, and his wife.
And do you remember much of what was different between living in Unadilla as a kid and living here in Pleasant Hill?
Not really. We're talking about a few years ago, but I guess what we could say is that living in Unadilla, you were next door, of course, to people you knew and like relatives, although they were not related to you, but they were all like relatives. They took care of you. They would feed you and just take care of you in the event your parents, who were my grandparents, had something else to do. And it was an enjoyable life as I remember it. Had some good friends that we came to the parting of the ways after moving to Macon, and most of whom I have never seen again, never heard of again. But moving to Macon, of course, was a big step for us. The faster life, a few more opportunities, a nicer schools, like L.H. Williams was just one of the very best schools, and of course Green Street was equally as nice, and we just found that the Macon was totally different.
And do you remember anything about your childhood? What kind of games you played, or what kind of activities you used to do as a kid here in Pleasant Hill?
Well, I remember as a small kid, I always liked automobiles. And my mother has told this story that after she brought me to Macon to live with her in early life, well, not really brought me to Macon, but I was with her in early life before I went to Unadilla. She had a day job, and there was an old automobile out in the front yard. And she could drop me over in that automobile, and I would just sit there and drive the car all day. I don't know how long she would be gone, but I would sit there and play in the automobile and just have fun by myself until she returned. And of course, growing up, that was one of my favorite things: driving the car, rolling tires, throwing balls, and playing with the other kids.
Mm-hmm. Did you go into downtown very much, or did you pretty much stay in the neighborhood? Did other kids go into town and then come back and do stuff?
Well, I can remember after moving back to Macon with my mother on Monroe Street, yes, we would go into town. I had several friends, and we would walk from Pleasant Hill to downtown Macon to the Douglas Theater. And on Saturdays, with Capitola tokens, we would visit the Douglas Theater and probably stay all day watching the same movie 2 or 3 times. And of course, this was a good little vacation, so to speak, or a little extra time for your parents to do things that they had to do to get rid of you for 3 or 4 hours. Go to the movie and have fun, and then come on back home, eat popcorn and whatever else was available to you for that nickel or dime that you had.
And you mentioned the tokens. What were those?
Tokens were a little metal coin like vehicle or a piece of merchandise, I should say, that was in Capitola flour. Capitola was one of the main brands back at that time. And when you would buy the Capitola flour, depending on the size, you would get either 1, 2, 3, or 4 Capitola tokens. And these were redeemable at the movie theater for admission.
Just at the movie theater?
Just at the movie theater. I don't remember anything else that you could redeem them for.
And was Capitola a local flour maker here in Macon?
No, it was a national concern.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know if they're still in business. I haven't heard of them in years, but that was a big thing for the kids in my growing up years.
Right. Was your mom pretty strict with you, or was she a very religious, devout woman, or was she? What was your perception of the way she raised you as a kid?
Well, she was religious, very, very hard on us. If she said to do something, we had to do it, and if not, we knew what was coming. And if she said, don't go out or don't do this or that, if you did, you were punished. And she would send us out to get a switch. And we would bring the switch in. Of course, the switch was not really a switch. Most cases, it was a branch off of a tree. Well, it felt like it. But anyway, this was what we were, whipped with. And we would get a little whipping. It was a whipping of love, though. You whip the kids when they do wrong back in those days, but not at a time when you are angry. You just give them a whipping to let them know right from wrong.
Right. And did you all have a garden at all in your yard?
No, not in Macon.
Okay.
No. Now we did have gardens in Unadilla with my grandparents. They had what we call a smokehouse, and that would be where they would store the meats that they would get from killing hogs, sausage, hams, whatever else you put in the smokehouse, and keep it throughout the winter months or on into spring and summer, and use it for cooking and for meals. And then, of course, in the garden, which was behind the house, where we stored the meats, we had collard greens, turnips, butter beans, and other vegetables, tomatoes that you grow in your family gardens. This was all in Unadilla. Now, we didn't have this in Macon.
Right. And when here in Pleasant Hill, do you remember, I was talking with a gentleman who lived in a neighborhood in downtown Atlanta. He remembers a lot of the smells coming from people's kitchens as they were walking down the streets and stuff. And
yes,
sometimes people just have them. Some people just have people come in the house and eat dinner with them,
yeah.
that kind of thing.
Oh yes, that was a tradition. That was a thing that happened. Friendly neighbors, if they were cooking something that you liked or the kids wanted, they would share it with each other, and it was a different time altogether at that time. Yeah.
Was there much interaction with white children and African American children here in Pleasant Hill, or was there pretty distinct boundaries between the different neighborhoods?
There were boundaries. There was no association at all during my early childhood days. We went to an all-black school, L.H. Williams, Green Street, Ballard High School, and Bedietta, which is just around the corner. The old building, I think, is still standing. It's not standing anymore. But these were all black schools.
Okay, and then even during playtime on the weekends and stuff, there wasn't any kind of integration between teams or anything like that?
No interaction with other races, so to speak.
Can you describe what your house was like? You said you were on Monroe Street when you came back,
right?
And how old were you when you came back to Pleasant Hill?
I must have been 7 or 8.
Okay,
something like that. The house was like a duplex, they called them. Families on each side with a bedroom, 2 bedrooms in most cases, kitchen, and a toilet. That was it. And our house was right on the corner, Monroe at Woodliff Streets. And of course, we stayed there for many years. Then after my mother married Mr. McIntosh, they moved to College Street, 161 College Street. Hey, I remember that. Down the hill, and what is Riverside Drive now was Jones Street at that time. And we lived right down in the first house on the left on College Street. And if you would go further, you would go into the cemetery. And there was a lot of activity at the cemetery, especially at night.
A lot of illicit activity?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, during the day, a lot of legal activity. Folks going fishing. They would walk through the cemetery to the Ocmulgee River.
And now, is this the Linwood Cemetery?
No. This was, I can't remember the name of it, although it's still standing. Riverside Cemetery.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then
huge cemetery. And some of our great leaders are buried there. Some well-known people are buried in that cemetery.
And you just have to walk through it to get to the Ocmulgee River to
right.
fish?
Yeah, you could walk through it to the Ocmulgee River, fish. You could drive through it in the evenings for a little rendezvousing, which was pretty well known in that area. Good neighbors also in that part of the city. Some of my best friends were from that area that I grew up with. John Millines, I don't know if you remember John Millines, Mary Millines, Jean Millines, and there were several others in that area, but it so happens that that family is one that I distinctly remember, because we were so close.
Oh, was that an African American family?
Oh yes, all African American families.
Okay.
In that area, in that neighborhood.
And what neighborhood was that?
Pleasant Hill.
Oh, still in Pleasant Hill.
Right,
okay.
still on Pleasant Hill. College Street, the lower end of College, below what is now Riverside Drive. It was called, as I said, Jones Street. That was the name of the street. And several prominent blacks lived in that area. The family that owned a shoe shop next to the Douglas Theater lived on that street. Their daughter is in my neighborhood now. She's married to a local minister. Pardon me. And a businessman lived in that area, Mr. Lee, W.C. Lee. He owned a place on Broadway known as the Douglas Grill that was sold to him by the famous Mr. Douglas, who founded the Douglas Theater and owned all this property. He had several properties in the Macon area. And of course, Mr. Lee went on to own the Dixie Theater, which was on Vineville Branch, pardon me, which is now just below the
Church's Fried Chicken.
Right. Below Church's Fried Chicken, which is on the corner of Monroe and
Hardeman.
Right. But down in the bottom of that area was called the Vineville Branch, and that's where the Dixie Theater was, and several grocery stores and other businesses. Right across was an animal hospital on the opposite side of the street.
And was the Douglas Theater and Dixie Theater, were those integrated theaters at all?
No, sir.
And were they owned by white men or black men?
Both were owned by black men. W.C. Lee owned the Dixie, and of course, Mr. Douglas founded and operated the Douglas Theater, the Douglas Hotel, the Douglas Grill, and a number of
And did
properties.
he live in Pleasant Hill?
No, he lived in the Unionville area.
Okay.
I know his family did in years later. I don't know if that's where he was originally, but his family was from the Unionville area. They lived on Montpelier Avenue.
Did you have much success fishing in the river?
I never went fishing in the
Oh,
river.
okay.
I've been fishing, I think, once or twice in my life, but never in the river.
Did you all go swimming in there
No.
at all?
No. We would walk from our neighborhood, the College Street neighborhood. We would walk out Ocmulgee Street, as it was known then, to a branch which was, I guess, approximately a mile and a half from our homes. and we would swim in the branch. And some of the braver soldiers would go on up to the waterworks, and they would find a place to swim up there. But we didn't ever, from our neighborhood, we did not go that far. We would just go down to the little branch, water up to your knees or something, jump in, you know.
Did many of the families here in Pleasant Hill have cars, or were they walking to most places?
Well, back in those days, cars were a scarcity. We caught the bus, we walked, and occasionally a friend or a family member would have a car, and we would, you know, ride. But I guess to a point, you might say, my family was lucky enough to have a relative who worked on the railroad, and we got what was called passes, which was free transportation to wherever you wanted to go if you get the pass to ride. So, but we didn't ever go any further than Unadilla to Macon, Macon to Fort Valley, and things like that. We didn't ever take any long trips.
Were there many families here in Pleasant Hill that were there 2 families per house? You said you lived in a duplex. Was that typical, or was it?
Typical. That was typical. In our neighborhood, anyway. There were some single family homes in the area, but those were more or less for kind of large families and families that had a little more income than we did.
And did people generally rent in the neighborhood, or did they own their own homes? Or
Rent was the thing.
And do you know who was there? One person that owned a lot of the homes, or were they just kind of split up among different owners? Or
different owners. One of the, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the big owners was a Willingham. You remember that name?
Willingham.
Yeah.
Dessau.
Dessau was the main one. Dessau. But there were several firms, rental firms, that owned these properties.
And were those African American owned firms or landlords, or were they predominantly white?
Predominantly white.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you remember? I was talking, as I mentioned earlier, the gentleman who lived in a neighborhood called Cabbagetown in Atlanta, and he remembers they used to have a rag man that would come through the neighborhood. He would have a cart was pulled by a mule. Did you have anything like that going on here? Did you have any interesting characters that come through the neighborhood or lived here? Do you remember?
I can't remember any at this time. Of course, most of the characters in our neighborhoods were interesting. Yeah, we had some interesting people in our neighborhoods. I remember, Little Richard, for instance, his family lived in our neighborhood, and his father was an interesting person. He had several, or I would say a couple of businesses, nightclub kind of businesses. I don't know if they would be considered nightclubs or joints or whatever they were referred to at that time. But you could go there and get a beer, get a drink or whatever you want, Coca-Cola or something stronger, Pepsi, you name it, whatever you wanted was available. And they were all in that area, in that neighborhood.
Do you remember the names of any of those places?
Nah.
Did they have live music at all?
No live music. You had what they called the jukeboxes. I don't remember any bands playing at any of those little joints, but they had jukeboxes and they would be blaring. You could hear them a couple of blocks away, but that was it.
And I suppose a lot of people had their musical influence from the church. Is that correct?
Yes, that is right. The church was a big influence on our musical backgrounds, especially in the black neighborhoods. Yes.
Is that where Little Richard got his informal training, I would guess.
Informal training, I would think, some at the church, and of course, Little Richard played piano by ear, and I guess he trained himself to a great degree. But he was a talented young man.
Was his whole family musically talented, or was it just...
No, just Richard. Just Richard.
And what do you remember about him before he became famous?
Well, I remember that he worked as a dishwasher in a downtown restaurant or club, and also the Greyhound bus station. He worked there, and of course, that's where he got a lot of his exposure because, pardon me, they had pianos, especially at the little club that was on Broadway. After doing his dishes and whatever chores, he would come out and bang on the piano, and patrons enjoyed it. And this was kind of a beginning for him.
The tunes he would be playing on the piano, were they gospel, R&B, country?
No, just R&B. Some of his own, most of the songs were his own creation. Tutti Frutti, and of course the words were Tutti Frutti, good booty, and it would go on, and of course that particular song, most of it was nay for the radios, but he improved on it by adding some other words instead of the good booty.
Oh, Rudy.
Yeah, oh, Rudy, right. Yeah, right. And, of course, Richard, I think, would be rated as the most famous artist from our area that I can think of, from Macon, because internationally he was known as one of the great entertainers, creator of rock and roll to a degree.
Were there any other musicians in the neighborhood that you remember?
Yeah, I remember some other musicians, some not by name. There was a guitar player that was also a roofer in the daytime, but he played guitar at night. And most of these musicians just picked up their instruments and, learned to play by ear. But he and several others, and as I grew older in high school, I learned to play alto saxophone and joined up with the Gladys Williams band, which was a famous band in the Macon area. Gladys played at both white and black clubs and entertainments, and she was very popular, and she played not just in Macon, but all over the state. She was all over the place, and I played sax for her. There was a Gordon Pinkston who played drums for her, a Jesse Hancock who played sax for her, Obie Kimbrough played trumpet, Lewis Hamlin played trumpet, and of course all of these musicians have all passed on now and left me here all by myself.
Did you have a specific artist or two that you were really influenced the way you played and that you really admired?
Eddie Cleanhead Vinson was my favorite. You remember Eddie?
I knew of her.
Yes, sir. Eddie Vinson was an alto sax player and blues singer. And I wanted to be an Eddie Vinson sax player. I didn't try to sing, but I wanted to play my sax like Eddie Vinson. But he was good.
Where was he from?
I don't really know. But he was an influence on this old soul and a good musician.
You knew Henry Nash, didn't you?
Yeah, I knew Henry Nash, who went on to become a big time professional operator. Yeah. Now he wasn't a musician, I don't believe, was he? Did he play music?
He played guitar in the Upsetters.
Okay.
When he first hooked up with Richard.
Okay. I didn't know he played, but I knew he went on to become a big time.
Wasn't known as a musician,
right?
But he did.
Yeah, I remember him as a big timer from the New York area, and of course, Macon was his home, and he was real famous, worldwide known.
And what kind of music do you remember coming out of the jukeboxes from these little corner stores? What type of music did people like to listen to?
The blues. Ruth Brown, Ruth Brown, Aretha Franklin, and of course there were several other singers and groups before them that I can't recall at the moment that were original blues singers, but in my years, Ruth Brown was big, and she married, by the way, a local saxophone player by the name of Earl Swanson. Earl was a great a great sax player. He played not only the blues and all, he was a jazz sax player from Macon, Georgia, and he married this famous woman, and he had a very popular brother too, Rudolph Swanson. You remember Rudolph?
No.
You don't remember Rudolph? Rudolph Swanson was a very he wasn't a musician of any sort, but he was a very popular young man. He was a waiter in restaurants and nightclubs, and he was well known by both white and blacks. Well liked.
Did people listen to country at all? Early country, like maybe Hank White or Jimmy Rogers, anything like that?
Well, yes.
Or Hank Snow, excuse me.
Country music has always been big and is still big in Macon, Georgia. In my early days in the radio, which started in 1954 on WBML, there was a country artist on radio station WIBB, Cousin Luke, I believe was his name, if my memory serves me correctly. But he was quite a country DJ, and of course since that time there have been hundreds and hundreds, and country music is still very big in this area.
So people that lived in the neighborhood, when you were a kid, you remember them listening to country music?
No.
Okay.
No, not in the black neighborhoods. They listened to the blues.
I see.
Things I used to do, I don't do anymore. Muddy Waters, and several other blues singers were very popular back in those days.
As a kid, did you think that you wanted to do musicianship for a living, be a musician for a living?
No, I did not. But as I grew up and learned to play the sax, I enjoyed doing what I was doing, but it was more or less as a sideline, not as a main gig, so to speak. But it was a good way to make some extra money and have an enjoyable time, meet all the gang, meet the ladies.
What steers you to radio, though?
Beg pardon?
What steers you to radio?
Okay.
DJ part?
Having been in the entertainment field for a few years, back in 1954, George Patton, who owned, he was a part owner of a local radio station, and he was a manager. He decided that he wanted to hire a black disc jockey. So he came to W.E. Holsey, who was the manager of the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, where I was employed at that time, and asked him to assist him in finding someone to put on the radio as a DJ, a black DJ, and that was the beginning for me.
Now, let me stop you here a second. Did you work in Atlanta at the time, or did they have a branch here in Macon?
That was a branch in Macon.
Okay.
Yeah, there's still a branch in Macon, Atlanta Life Insurance.
Okay.
But I was one of the local agents. There were several agents in the in the Macon office. And Holsey recommended me. I went down and did an interview. And, of course, at that time, the main thing they wanted to do was find someone who was kind of keen on the kind of music that the black audience would enjoy or like, and could also relate to the black audience, as they called it back then, talk jive talk. That was it. Of course, now it's not jive talk anymore. It's the rapping and it's a different story altogether. But that was one of the requirements of becoming a DJ at that time, being able to play the music, the music, to know the music, and be able to talk jive. And in 1954, I started with WBML on a 30-minute broadcast, evolved into an hour broadcast. It was all sponsored by the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. From an hour, it went to 2 hours, and from 2 hours to full time. And also it led to the employment of several, or some others I should say, like Palmyra Braswell. She was hired as the first black female DJ in Macon. And there was a black quartet leader that was hired to play gospel music at night. This was all at night. All of our broadcasting was at night because this was what they wanted to ease into and see how it would go over. And lo and behold, they did the rating thing on WBML, and we came through with a rating of 58%. I think it was 58 or 59% of the audience was listening. So they became very excited and wanted to go full time.
Audience in Macon as a whole? Or?
Yeah, as a whole. Macon as a whole. 58% of the audience. Of all the stations, there must have been at least 4 or 5.
So you would have had a sizable white listening audience as well.
We did. We had quite a white audience at that time. And Cadden decided that he wanted to add more time and add daytime to his broadcast scheduling, which he did. And that led to WIBB, which had Uncle Ned on most of the day with other broadcast series. That led, yeah, right. That led to them deciding that they wanted to go at least 50%. So instead of having a full day of country and whatever else he was broadcasting, he had a half day of country. It was a daytime station, by the way.
And it was a country music they'd play during the day?
Yeah, country music on WBML. WIBB. And with Cousin Luke from 6 a.m. to 12 noon, country. And then from 12 noon till sign-off, which was sundown, we had black music. And I was the main culprit.
Now, was BLM and IBB 2 separate stations?
2 separate stations, right.
Okay, so you started out on BLM.
WBML.
BML, and then you became such a popular show, you went over to IBB after that?
Right, they talked me into coming over to IBB later on, after my show was so famous, or so popular, I should say, and after IBB decided to go half day with black music, they hired two DJs. One was Big Saul, or Charles Green, and the other was Ray Satellite Papa Brown. And after several years, well, I say several years, after 2 or 3 years of broadcasting, they wanted to bring me over to join the two black guys they had and get rid of country altogether, which they did. And we became known as the Three Horsemen. Big Saul would come on in the morning. I would come on at 11 o'clock. Big Saul would open up at 6 till 11. I would come on at 11 with gospel music. And at 1:30, Satellite Papa, Ray Brown, would come on with R&B music. I would come back at 3:30 to sign off with the latest R&B. So that was our schedule.
And when was sign off? What time?
Sundown. Sundown varied.
Okay.
Like November, December, sign off is 5:30 p.m.
So they would stop airing at sundown, or would they go to a different program?
No airing. Cut off the air. FCC rules.
Oh, so you didn't have night?
No, we didn't have night broadcasting. The only time we had night broadcasting was like summer months. June, July, we would go up to 8:45.
Right.
That was as late as we would stay on, and that's sundown. We had our FCC license permitted us to broadcast. That's WIBB, to broadcast from sun up to sundown. And of course, they dropped the sun up and changed it to 6 a.m. So we could sign on at 6 a.m., but we definitely had to sign off at sundown.
Do you know what the reason was for that?
No, this was an FCC rule for certain stations because you have so many stations on the same frequency.
I see.
And the lesser stations had to be off the air and out of the way of the big time stations at night.
I see. And what was the primary difference between BLM and IBB?
Well, WBML was like kind of a full feature station. They had news, they had popular music. They didn't have any country. They had popular music with Don King. You remember Don? John, and there were a couple of other guys too that I can't recall at the moment. But anyway, they had full-time news on the spot news broadcast, which was their big feature. If there was a fire or a fight or something, the BML news machine with their reporter was on the scene broadcasting. If there was a fight going on, the reporter would be down behind the vehicle broadcasting what was happening. It was quite interesting, but it was an audience getter because people wanted to know what was happening, and that was part of their feature. On the scene news, full-time broadcasting, and BML was not required to sign off at any particular time. They could stay on as long as they want. And in fact, I'm thinking they stayed on till 1 in the morning. I don't remember exactly, but I'm thinking it was like 1 in the morning.
So did they have more listeners than IBB did?
Yes.
Okay, it was a bigger station.
Yeah, bigger station, and with all the features, and especially the news. But when we went full time, all black, we took over the audience scene in Macon from 6 a.m. till sign off. From 6 a.m. to sign off, WIBB was number one.
And what was it that attracted you to switch stations? Okay. And how long were you at BML before going over to IBB?
I was at BML 3 years, almost 4 years. I went there in 54. I left in 57, so it was 3 years.
So you mentioned that they were looking for a disc jockey, and they went to your boss and asked if he knew anybody. Did you hear about it, or did he come to you and say, you're interested in this? Or
Yes, he came to me. And in fact, he recommended me because he knew that I was playing with Gladys Williams' band and other bands in the area, and I was pretty up on all of the music that was popular. So he just figured that I might be the one. And of course, there were several that took the audition, and it was quite a surprise to me that I was picked, because some of them were pretty heavy people.
how old were you at the time?
I was in my 20s.
Okay. Did you immediately like it when you started it?
Oh yes, I loved broadcasting because all of the attention you get, and
Could you play what you wanted to play? Or-
at that time you could, but most of our music after a certain length of time was requested music. We played, folks would write in, and you would not believe the mail that we would receive. And then of course we later went to phone requests, but our main requests were mail.
And how far away did the signal carry?
With WBML, we had a 1,000 watter, so we barely got to the city limits. But WIBB was a 5,000 watter, and we covered several counties all around. We went into Dublin, we went into Fort Valley, Milledgeville, Sparta, Sandersville, Irvington, several areas around. With I guess we were heard within almost 100-mile radius, or daily.
Did you immediately acquire a nickname when you went on air? Was that something you knew you had to do, or is it something that just kind of came naturally?
Well, this was something that was popular. This was the way they handled the black DJs back in that day. They gave them a catchy name, King B, Big Saul, Satellite Papa. Those were our three.
And how did you get King B?
This was something that George Patton, the original guy that I went to work for, this is a name that he selected, King B. And of course, then when they hired Palmyra Braswell, our first female, she was Honey Bee, and so on.
Right. And could you talk a little bit about what type of you played music, but obviously there was probably more to that than the station. There was a sense of community and a sense of rapport with the community. Can you talk a little bit about that? What kind of communication and relationship you had with the people of Macon on air?
On the air, we had a great relationship with most of our listeners. As I said, we played mostly requested music, and they would call or write. And of course, at first it was all written request, but then it got to the point where in the afternoon, after school, students would come by the station and gather in the not the computer room, but in the control room, or the B studio, so to speak, which was about half as large as this room, and they would be up against a big glass case, holding up their mail, the songs they wanted to hear, and the persons that they wanted to play the songs for. And this was a daily thing, Monday through Friday. And of course, we could track the popularity by the sales in local stores of the records that we played.
Were you ever challenged with somebody coming, or how often were you challenged with somebody coming up with a request that you didn't have the record or hadn't heard of the artist before?
Yeah, we had that, and we made a lot of substitutions, but most of the songs were songs that we were playing on a regular basis. We would read what was known as the Billboard magazine, which listed the popular records, 1 through 100. On the popular side, pop records. Then on the R&B side, you would get the top 50. So we tried to always keep up with what was going on nationwide by reading every week the Billboard magazine. And we had our own top 10 or top 20 or whatever it was, and that worked out really fine.
And I guess back in the day, they didn't have the internet, so the kids would pretty much be turned out of the music strictly from the radio.
That was it. And a lot of the white kids were not allowed to play or listen to the black radio station. So what they would do, they had the little transistor radios. They would take them in their rooms and put them under their pillows and listen as long as the music was being played.
Because their parents didn't want them to listen to
the parents did not want them to listen to black radio.
It was Pat. Well, they had Pat Boone back then. Was the big white, and then when Elvis came along, it was scandalous because
But that was after.
Yeah, right.
They were later. There were things that were when they first made the transistor radios. They added a little feature later on, which was an earpiece.
Earplug, right? Yeah, right.
And you could plug that thing in, sit it in your shirt pocket, and no one had to know what you were listening to.
That's
and
right.
That's when the white kids, because the crossover was starting then.
Yes.
When people like Chuck Berry would play. Chuck Berry had a crossover audience, and when he played, all kind of things happened, and they couldn't control it because.
And what year was that about? Like 55, 54?
It was in that same time
somewhere.
frame.
Around 50. I would think Chuck came along 55 to 60, somewhere around there.
Because I've got a recording at home. It's Elvis had just signed with RCA, and he came back to Memphis for Christmas. This was '56, and he dropped in on Jerry Lewis's recording session, and they were singing Chuck Berry's. They were covering Chuck Berry stuff because he was really popular, and so that was where the crossover comes in.
You know, I wanted to let you know that people now look at Pleasant Hill boundaries that were established back in the 1980s. But you have to understand that Pleasant Hill was much larger than that to us. Okay? And so when you hear College Street, see, I know you that kind of threw you.
Yeah.
But you see, then it extended also across Monroe Street, okay, halfway to Tatnall Square Park, because one of our hospitals was there that we had in Pleasant Hill, and I don't mean to take away from what you said.
Yes.
There
Want
were
to
just
add
certain
that,
things that I wanted to kind of add into this.
Right. Well, you know a little bit more about Pleasant Hill than I do because you were born in Pleasant Hill, right? And I only came in later.
But it was still, it's still what we were trying to get to is the fact that the people of Pleasant Hill and what the flavor and all that it meant to those people who, no matter whether you lived here a couple of years or you lived here all your life, what it meant, what it felt like to be here, and how did it affect you going out, living your life,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And those were the things that we were trying to get across to people, and I think that's, you know, those things that we really wanted to hear that stuff though about, you know, you and radio and.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do you remember any particular songs that just caught on like fire and went off the charts right off the bat?
Yes. With Richard, of course, Tutti Frutti, and he had several others that were very hot records. And along came James Brown in '56. Of course, James was not originally from Macon. Our son was Little Richard. Macon's son was Little Richard. James Brown came in from Augusta and that area, but he got his start, his beginning to popularity, to stardom, all started here in Macon. And of course with James, that was Please, 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 which was a super hit. Yeah. And there were so many James Brown hits that, and of course, James was devoted mostly to black audience, to the black audience. He did crossover. He did have crossover, but 90% of his audience was black.
And
Otis Redding.
yeah, I was surprised the other day. I was looking up Otis Redding on the internet, and he died when he was 25.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that
26.
that young man was singing that kind of music at that age is
right.
unreal.
Yeah.
What Otis Redding was from Georgia as well, wasn't he?
Yes, he was from Dawson, Georgia. Grew up in Macon, and went to school here. His family moved from Dawson to Macon when he was a youngster, and this is where he got his start, right here in Macon, singing at the local clubs, the local theater, teenage parties at the Douglas Theater and the Roxy, and associated with Alan and Phil Walden, the Walden brothers, who had a booking agency. They booked bands into different colleges, fraternity parties, sorority parties for the white teenagers, because the schools were not integrated back in those days. And this is how he got his start.
Did any of those guys, Little Richard, Otis Redding, James Brown, ever come into the studio?
All the time, yes, quite frequently did they visit with us, especially if they were in the, of course they had to be in the area. I started to say if they're in the area, but I'm saying that if James was in the Macon area, traveling through or stopping to see his manager, who was a local guy, Clint Brantley, he would stop by the studio to see us and bring copies of his latest record. This was one of his big things, to deliver personally his new recordings, his new releases to the radio stations. And of course, Otis lived in Macon. He married a local young lady. They have a family. They first lived in downtown, not downtown Macon, but in the city limits, over near Chestnut Street in Macon. And later, after he hit the big time, he bought this big plot of land in Jones County, where the big old ranch is located. That's where he's buried.
Did the James Brown and Little Richard, were they a local, regional, or national phenomenon? Did it start out locally and then just grew, or was it immediately kind of regional, national?
It all started locally, even with James, it started locally. With Otis, of course, it all started locally. Doing nightclubs, frat parties, sorority engagements, and of course James had his first record, Please Please, recorded at the WIBB studio. It was not a full recording. It was a recording that was done on an acetate disc, which played inside out instead of outside in. It was what we used for our local commercials, but we recorded him on that, or at least Big Saul, one of our DJs, Charles Green, recorded it, and we played it. It became very popular, and this was what shot him to stardom. Someone was passing through and heard it. One of the big executives from King's Records stopped through. I directed him to his manager, who was Clint Brantley, and the rest is history.
So how did that come about? How did they decide? Was his first recording? Did somebody just say, "You're so good, we want to get you on acetate"? How did that first recording come about?
He just wanted to make a recording, and he got together with Charles Green. This was one of their original songs. James Brown and his Famous Flames, this little group that came in to Macon from up near Augusta. And they had been singing this song for I don't know how long, locally. And he wanted to put it on a record, and they did, without a band, a cappella. They did this recording, and it was a very popular song for them. We had requests on top of requests for it. And of course, the executive heard it and hooked up with Clint Brantley and got him signed with King's Records in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Do you remember at all when that acetate was actually recorded? Do you remember the recording session or anything about it?
No, I don't, but it was probably in the year of 57, I would think late 57.
And James Brown, you said James Brown and the Flames?
And the Famous Flames.
The Famous Flames. Would they travel all around Georgia, or was Macon a hotbed for R&B music at the time?
Well, Macon has always been a hotbed for R&B music, but Clint Brantley, their manager, who sent to Augusta to bring them into Macon, he'd heard about them, and he brought them in, and he booked them from his office into all the little nightclubs within a 50 to 75, 100-mile radius. So they had weekend engagements that he put together, and that's the way they got their start.
And do you think they were doing this simultaneously in the Atlanta area as well, or was it just pretty much
just Macon area?
And why is that, do you think?
Well, because they had not reached that level, that Atlanta level, at that particular time. Of course, after they signed up with King Records, and their record became a hit, then Atlanta and wherever else was their territory. They were all over the place.
I see. How long were you at WIBB?
22, 23 years.
And when you were doing your show, were you pretty much just, you yourself as a DJ, were you just kind of transitioning from record to record, or would you have periods during your broadcast where you talked about the jiving earlier, where you'd kind of talk with the community or have like your own little show yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. Between records, you had a little jive talk, you had the request line, and you had commercials. That's how we earned a living, with commercials. But yeah, there was always the audience that you talked with, or the phone calls that you had that you talked about, and you talked about the music you were playing, the artist, where they were from, the song, if you knew anything about it. And of course, that was your job to, find out and learn something about the music and the artist.
And do you have any regular characters that would call in that kind of became personalities in their own right?
Yeah, there were several callers. I guess who we could say became famous by calling the radio station. I don't recall the names. That was one Pearly something that I remember, one name, and of course there were several others, hundreds of others who would call and write, on a regular basis. But yeah, they made themselves famous by requesting different songs and being on the radio all the time. Dane Scott, you remember that name, don't you?
Yeah.
Dane Scott, he grew up around the radio station as a little kid. He started coming, and he and several of his buddies, there was one called Crocodile, they would come every day, and they would stand in the studio for a couple of hours or more and request songs and get their names on the radio. So, yeah.
Would you ever let him take over the mic?
No, we didn't do that.
Okay.
We would just see. We're in separate rooms.
I see.
And I'm in the control room, and they are in the studio, broadcast studio. But they could communicate with me with papers, and they could even talk to me between records, and we could converse with each other.
And you'd mentioned that they were interested in doing the African American dialect, the jiving. Do you remember any phrases or expressions from back then that were unique to that
particular time? No, I don't know.
No.
The opening line, when we had a theme song we would play to start the show off, and after about 30 seconds of that theme song, you would lower the volume, and then you would introduce yourself. Have no fear, the king is here. And that was it. And we would go on from there,
Do you remember the call-ins of the other two DJs, how they would open up their show?
Well, yeah, now Satellite, that we just buried a month or so ago, 6 weeks ago or so, he and Saul have both passed on. But Satellite had the sound of the rocket coming in, from the sky, out of the atmosphere. And he would come on with his intro. I don't remember all the words, but he had an intro. And so did Big Saul, who was the morning DJ. And but we all had our own intros and jive words and phrases that we used doing our shows.
Uh-huh. Do you think you'd be able to pretend that you're going on the air right now? Do you think you'd be able to kind of pretend and do a little spiel about how you'd run your show?
Well, I don't know. It's been a long time.
Uh-huh.
It's been probably over 30 years since I've done that.
Yeah.
He was Mr. Smooth. But, I mean, everybody knew that voice.
It's a great radio voice.
Yeah.
Everybody knew that voice, and he had this charisma. See, the ladies loved it.
In class.
Yeah, he had a way of saying what he said, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. And he used to tell me, turn the radio up loud. And they would.
Yeah.
We would turn it up.
The ladies were Sugar Sugar. Yeah, that and Sugar Sugar. What's going on at your place, or what are you doing later? Just some jive talk, and what do you want to hear today? What can I lay on your ears? That kind of thing, But we're talking a few years back, and of course all of that's old school now, and there's a new thing going on that I really like. I like the new thing that the DJs are doing now. They moved a little beyond all of that old time rap, and they're moving into a smoother groove now. So,
but that was more your speed than anyway. This was what you had, and I think that was why you had such. I mean, all you guys had popularity. I grew up on these guys, so I can talk about them because I was one of the ones out there listening on the radio, and but it was they had each one had their own style. But to me personally, you I liked how smooth you were. You know.
Thank you.
And it was just you remember Hamp? Do you remember Randy's record mark?
Yeah, from Nashville, 50,000 watt station.
50,000 watt. When he was talking about the wattage size and certain stations having to go off the air, I was a DJ at a station in Savannah when I was at State, and it was the first automated radio station in Savannah. And because I was in electronics engineering, I was brought in to dial down power at night. And it was 24-hour station, but I would do from 11:30 till 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was to allow those bigger stations to come in. They wouldn't have to try to overshadow the local stations, so you could hear those
the big boys.
Right.
And even when I was in Virginia at St. Emma, I used to my little transistor radio, which I wasn't supposed to have on the dorm because it was military academy. But put the pillow over your head and the earpiece in, and listen to, because Randy's record mark would come in right about 11:30, quarter.
John R.
Yeah.
You remember John R?
Yes.
What was John R? Where was that
from?
from?
He was a DJ.
Out of Randy's record mark in Nashville?
Out of Nashville.
Right. WLAC.
And they'd play R&B?
Yes, they
did. Let me tell you, they would rock you.
Yes.
Did
they influence your style at all?
Yes, they did. They influenced a lot of stations all over the country.
That's right.
Randy's record shop had all of the latest records, and this was their way of advertising, having them played on the WLAC, which was a 50,000 watter, and you could hear it all over the country. All over the country, you could hear. In fact, I've talked with some servicemen who said that they heard WLAC overseas.
Yeah, I know. I had no problem in Virginia, in Richmond. I had no problem.
Now, would they pick up on James Brown and Little Richard too after you guys had started doing them?
Well, I'm sure they did. I don't really remember hearing Little Richard and James Brown or Otis or any of those on that particular station, but I'm sure they did.
I remember hearing it.
Okay.
But that was later on. That was in the 60s.
Okay.
But yeah, they did pick them up.
Can you talk a little bit about? You probably knew each one of them fairly well. Can you talk a little bit about what they were like as just not rock and roll stars, or just as regular people?
Well, starting with Little Richard, great personality, and of course, he was, as I said, our own. He was Macon born and all right here in Macon off of Fifth Avenue, which is right across the interstate. And he was a fancy dresser, wore loud colors, and a pompadour hairdo. and of course, like I said earlier, he did his own music. He taught himself to play the piano, and I think he also played the drums. But he was quite an entertainer.
From the get-go? You remember him as a kid being that way?
Yes, right. From the first time I met him, he was he had that kind of influence. Then, of course, after Richard came James Brown, Clint Brantley that I mentioned earlier was Richard's manager. He was also the manager for James Brown. He brought James, as I said earlier, into the Macon area. James was a flashy dresser, hairstyles, hair always, perfectly laid back, and his big thing, the big thing for James was his ability to dance. He was quite a dancer, on stage now and performing. He could do all kinds of tricks with the mic. He could dance. He could do a split. And one of his big things, of course, was his Please, Please, Please performance, where he would have on this cape and singing his song, Please, Please, which was his initial song, the first song that he made. He would sing so much of it, he would sling off the cape and start off the stage. Then he would get so far, and then he'd come back and take the mic and start singing again. He was quite a performer. Otis, I would say, copied Richard to a degree. He copied Little Richard with, in the beginning, he copied Little Richard somewhat. But as the time grew on, wore on, he kind of developed his own style and started recording and writing his own songs, and he was quite talented. He would go in the studio and he could tell the horn section what he wanted them to do, what the drummer he wanted him to do, the piano. He was quite a talent.
And did he record here in Macon? His records?
I don't remember Otis recording anything ever in Macon. I think James may have recorded one or two songs at what is now the Jones Brothers Mortuary. That was a recording studio.
And where's that?
That's out in my area of town off of Sherland Drive. It's on Millerfield Road. And I'm thinking that James recorded at least once or twice there. Richard may have recorded there, I'm not certain. But most of the Browns recording were in Cincinnati. Of course, he did quite a few live performances, live at the Apollo Theater in New York and other theaters in other places. Otis was the same way, not that he recorded in Cincinnati. He recorded in Memphis. Most of his recordings were made in Memphis at the Stax studio. And of course, he made several live recordings at different concerts. And one of his biggest hits was at a concert, I think it was in California, Try a Little Tenderness. Have you ever heard that? You've heard that? That was recorded, I believe, in California. But they all had their own personalities. They were different personalities and different, in the way they performed and all. But all great performers.
So you were on air for quite a while. Can you talk a bit about how the radio changed from the 50s going into the 60s and 70s? What were some of the changes that happened?
Well, one of the big changes I think of is from AM to FM. And of course, we're talking about a technical end here that I can't address that well, because I know that the AM was the way everything started. Progression brought on FM, and with FM, the music had a bigger, wider sound, and you could get a longer distance with your FM studios or FM towers than you could with the AM. And of course, the music itself, radio itself, has changed dramatically over the years. It's much smoother. In the earlier days when I started, we were the pioneers. We just kind of set the pace. But now you've got guys who have gone to different broadcast schools, colleges, and they are smooth as silk, and there are blacks in every phase of the business: owners, newscasters, sports announcers, reporters, so there's been a big change.
Can you talk a little bit about how the music itself changed from the 50s going into the 70s?
Well, yes, the music change has been big. It's been there has been a big change in the way the music is performed. And here again, we're talking about schools learning, becoming better at what you do. Musicians are better musicians now. Singers are better singers. Oh my, we've got some singers that are just unreal. The musicians, everything is different now. It's much smoother. The recordings are better quality, and all of this, of course, is an evolution of time. Over the years, this has happened.
What do you listen to yourself nowadays? What do you like to listen to?
Kenny G.
Smooth jazz?
Yeah. But I like to listen to all types of music. I like to listen to contemporary gospel. I like the old traditional gospel. We've got a little of that, a little of both in this city. And we've got great R&B stations, or I don't know if they're referred to as R&B stations anymore, because they aren't just R&B, they're playing everything now. Yeah, right, and very smooth broadcast. The FM stereo stations, there aren't many, if any, of the old AM broadcasting stations anymore. It's all FM and FM stereo, and digital radio, and all of this high-tech stuff.
So when FM started coming into being, did the tenor of broadcasting change as far as people became more professional and it was less informal and it was more structured after FM?
Yes, definitely. It started with the change from AM, FM, stereo, and all of that, and of course, time. Announcers are better announcers. They're more articulate. Musicians are better. Singers are better. It's just something that happened with time.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of any other stations that you used to get from outside Macon? You mentioned a station in Nashville. Were there any other national stations that influenced the musical tastes here in Macon?
I don't think there are any other stations that influenced the Macon music acceptance like, say, WLAC did. I think the local stations have taken that over now. We've got local stations, local announcers who have been to school and studied broadcasting, and musicians that are better. So I think now the thing is we are influenced by Macon and the current music that's out.
Right, but back when you were a kid, you can't think of anything else besides WLAC as far as music coming from outside on the radio.
I really can't, because anytime I heard a good station, I would listen. But as a kid, I remember before LAC, I always did like music. I remember the Hit Parade. That was before your time. The Hit Parade with Frank Sinatra. The young ladies swooning, so they called it, whenever Frank would sing. And I don't remember what station that was that we would listen to, but it was this. I mean, I can remember as far back as when I was growing up in Unadilla of listening to the Hit Parade, because you would always hear the good music, Frank Sinatra, and the girls swooning.
Can you remember any of the other artists that would come over the Hit Parade?
No, I don't. The Hit Parade was Frank's thing. Yeah. Now, of course, there may have been some others, but as far as I can remember, it was all Frank Sinatra.
When on BLM and WIBB, was there any white crossover? Was there any point where white artists were started to be played on those stations?
I always included white artists in my program, and I have some CDs that I made years ago, shipping to some of the soldiers and all who were overseas who wanted requested CDs of our music back home. And I tried to include whatever was popular. And there are several groups. I can't remember the names of the groups, but there were, in the early days of the Jackson 5, there was another white group that was very popular.
Wasn't Dave Clark, was it?
No.
No, the Osmonds.
Osmond.
The Osmonds.
Yeah, right.
That would have been early 70s?
Okay. Yeah, right.
The Osmonds were the white kids, and the Jackson 5 were the black kids.
And I played both the Osmonds and the Jackson 5. And in some cases, you couldn't tell the difference.
Leslie Gore. I remember.
Yeah, right.
I used to hear you play Leslie Gore.
Yeah, right. I played Leslie Gore.
Mm-hmm. I knew about Leslie Gore.
What about Elvis? Do you remember him when his stuff came out?
I played some Elvis, and always had a great amount of fun playing Elvis. And I remember something that I would say, Elvis, don't just do something, stand there. That was a line I remember from Elvis. Don't just do something, stand there, because Elvis was always doing something.
Yeah, he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they'd only film him waist up.
Yeah, because he was moving. But I included the white artists. In fact, I think I have a CD in my automobile right now of one of my shows that included some white artists.
Oh, what year would that be?
That was probably 70s.
Wow. So you've
Early
got
70s.
recordings of your shows then?
I have a few recordings. Like I said, I would send recordings to servicemen overseas.
I see.
And I had one serviceman who made a bulk recording on a reel-to-reel, and he brought it back. And I dubbed off several, I guess 4 or 5 different shows that he had that I had sent to him earlier in Germany. And I have one that in fact, when we finish here, I'll get it for you.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
You think we could get a copy of that?
Yeah, I'll get the copy.
That'd be good to have as an archive as well.
Yeah, right.
You gotta understand that there were other DJs, but he was like the core guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was like the core guy because he was like the polished diamond. He was like when they first learned how to cut diamonds. he was the cut diamond.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is and I understand why that gentleman, recommended you because his voice, he was very articulate. And you have to understand one thing. In those days, we all walked around with our hearts in our mouths. Whenever somebody that looked like us would be on TV or on radio, because, you know, he could speak the English language. He knew the language. He was smooth. He was debonair. I mean, all of this stuff. It was how we wanted to present ourselves as a race, and this is what he was doing. These are the things that we were. I know we put a lot of stuff on people's shoulders then and still now, but that's the way it was. Whenever somebody stepped out, we put all of that on them, and he was the guy who shouldered it.
I had one more question. Where were the studios of BLM and WIBB?
Okay, when I was hired at WBML, the studio was on 2nd Street, right in front of the old bank. What was that? BL?
Shoot, wait a minute.
You know, the courthouse is here.
Yeah.
It was diagonally across.
The Bakers.
The courthouse is here.
Yeah.
And there's a bank there. Then there's an alley, and the building that's on the corner of the alley and 2nd Street was where the office and studios of
you know what, you're bringing it back to me now. Yeah,
WBML, and right across the street was the Ford dealership.
Right.
It was right in front of the Ford dealership, but that was on 2nd Street for WBML. The office and studios of IBB was on Mulberry Street, 830 Mulberry Street. Also in that same building, the office of Alan and Phil Walden.
Walden, yeah.
Yes, and several other offices were in that building, but I remember Alan and Phil being there. But we were on the ground floor, downstairs, WIBB.
Now, remind me, the Waldens, they were associates with James Brown, you'd said earlier? Or
The Waldens did not.
Or was it Little Richard?
They represented Otis.
Okay.
Yeah, Otis. They did not have Richard or James, but they had Otis. In fact, Otis was a partner. Not only did they book and manage him, but he was a partner in their firm. Redwall, right. Yes. And their building is still standing on Cotton Avenue now.
As a matter of fact, they're going through renovation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a beautiful building, and it's going to be nice when they finish.
Do you remember that the day Otis Redding's plane crashed and he died?
Yes, I do.
How did that affect the community and the listening audience?
Oh, that was a big shock. We were all left speechless. That particular night, I was at the bowling alley with friends on Sherlin Drive. It was not a league night. It was just that we were down just open bowling, and received a phone call. I don't remember exactly who it was that called me. They had called my house, and my wife told them that I was at the bowling alley, and they said to me, "Have you heard about Otis?" I said, "No, what about Otis?" They said his plane crashed, and they think he is dead. I said, "No," and yes. I said, "That can't be." He said, "Yes." He was on his way to wherever he was scheduled to play, and the plane crashed. So immediately I said, "Okay, thank you." Turned on the radio on WNEX, and it was on the air. that his plane had crashed, and at that particular time they didn't know whether he had survived or not, but they did know the plane had crashed. So that got my bowling for that night.
Yeah.
I packed up, went home, and sat by the radio until I don't know what time, but listening to the latest news, and that's how I found out about